Picture a quiet morning in a small New England mill town. It's October 1894. The air is crisp, smoke rises from chimneys, and the first shift workers are making their way through cobblestone streets toward the textile factory. This town, like hundreds of others across New England, was built around a single purpose: textile production. The mill was the heartbeat of the community. It employed nearly half the town's population. It dictated the rhythm of daily life. When the mill whistle blew, people woke up. When it blew again, they went to work. When it blew a third time, they went home. But on this particular October morning, something was about to happen that would be remembered for generations. At exactly 7:12 a.m., something changed. A low, trembling sound began to emerge from somewhere in the valley. But this wasn't a sound you just heard. This was a sound you felt deep in your chest, in your bones, before your ears could even process it. Imagine standing in your kitchen, pouring coffee, when suddenly you feel a pressure in your chest. Not painful, but deeply unsettling, like your rib cage is vibrating. You freeze. You look around. The cup in your hand is trembling. The water in the basin is rippling in perfect concentric circles. Within seconds, doors began to shake. Dogs started howling in confusion, that primal, instinctive howl that dogs make when they sense something fundamentally wrong with the world. Windows vibrated so violently that some cracked, sending thin spiderweb fractures across the glass. And the people, they froze, because no one knew what was happening. Mary Henderson, a school teacher who kept a detailed diary, would later write, "It was as if the earth itself had begun to groan. I have never felt such fear, not even during the tremor of '92. This was different. This was alive." What was this sound? And more importantly, where was it coming from? The sound didn't stay contained. It grew louder, echoing through the narrow streets and bouncing off the steep valley walls. The town's geography, which had made it perfect for water-powered mills, now turned into a natural amplifier, magnifying the noise until it was inescapable. You have to understand the acoustics at play here. This wasn't just a loud noise. The valley acted like a giant megaphone, focusing and intensifying the sound waves. The frequency, somewhere around 20 to 30 hertz, was low enough to resonate with the natural frequency of wooden structures. Houses weren't just near the sound. They were vibrating in harmony with it. Panic spread like wildfire. On Maple Street, Samuel Briggs, a Civil War veteran who had survived Gettysburg, ran out of his house, convinced it was an earthquake. He shouted for his neighbors to get into the street, away from buildings that might collapse. Within minutes, half the street had followed his lead. At the schoolhouse on Church Hill, Miss Henderson tried to maintain order, but it was impossible. The children could feel the vibration through the floorboards. Some of them were crying. Others were staring wide-eyed at the windows, watching them shake. When one window finally cracked with a sharp pop, that was it. The children bolted. Parents who heard the commotion came running. Soon, the school was empty. At the general store, old Thomas Whittaker, who had lived in the town for 73 years, stood behind his counter with tears running down his face. He kept repeating the same thing. The earth is opening, just like in Revelations. The earth is opening. Some thought it was an earthquake. The town had experienced a minor tremor just 2 years earlier, a 4.2 magnitude quake that had cracked a few walls and knocked some items off shelves. People remembered that feeling, but this was different. Earthquakes come in waves. This was constant. Others feared a massive boiler explosion at the mill. Industrial accidents were tragically common in this era. Just the year before, a boiler explosion in Massachusetts had killed 17 workers and been heard 15 miles away. Could that be happening here? A few even whispered that it was the earth itself splitting open. In an age before seismology was well understood, before the theory of plate tectonics, natural disasters carried an almost supernatural dread. The town square filled with confused, frightened faces. Men in work clothes, women in house dresses, children clutching their parents' hands. Everyone talking at once, everyone with a different theory. "It's the mine," someone shouted. There was a small coal operation 3 miles north. No, it's the dam, another voice countered. The reservoir dam is breaking. Church bells rang out in alarm, adding to the cacophony. The priest at St. Michael's, Father O'Brien, began ringing the bells as a call to gather, to seek shelter, to pray. But the bells only added to the chaos. And still, the sound continued. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. People began making desperate decisions. Some families loaded children into wagons and headed out of town, thinking that distance might save them. Others ran toward the mill, convinced that's where the danger originated and that they might be able to help. For 20 agonizing minutes, no one knew if they should run, hide, or pray. Because the sound wouldn't stop. While the town spiraled into panic, the answer lay inside the very building that defined this community, the textile mill. The Riverside Textile Mill was a 4-story brick building that stretched nearly 200 feet along the river. It housed 140 looms, employed 300 workers, and produced thousands of yards of cotton fabric every week. It was a monument to industrial progress. But industrial progress, in 1894, was still learning some hard lessons. Just 3 weeks earlier, the factory had installed something new, an experimental steam-powered siren designed to alert workers in case of emergency. Fire was a constant threat in textile mills. The combination of cotton dust, wooden floors, and all-soaked machinery made them incredibly flammable. Mill fires were a regular occurrence, and they could turn deadly in seconds. The factory owner, Jonathan Whitmore, had attended an industrial safety conference in Boston where he'd seen a demonstration of a new steam siren system. Unlike traditional bells or whistles, this device could produce an ear-splitting wail that could supposedly be heard for miles. In an emergency, every second counted. This siren, Whitmore believed, could save lives. He ordered one immediately. The siren was installed on the roof of the mill, connected directly to the main boiler's steam system. It was an impressive piece of engineering, a brass cylinder nearly 4 feet tall with a complex series of valves and resonance chambers. The manufacturer, a company called Industrial Safety Systems out of Philadelphia, had assured Whitmore it was state-of-the-art. But on this October morning, something went catastrophically wrong. The night shift supervisor, a man named Robert McIntyre, had noticed something odd around 6:45 a.m. The pressure gauge on the main boiler was reading higher than normal. Not dangerously high. The safety valve should have released any excess pressure automatically, but higher than usual. He made a note to mention it to the day shift supervisor, but thought nothing more of it. At 7:12 a.m., something inside the siren's valve system jammed. Now, this is where the engineering becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. The siren was designed to work like this. When activated, a valve would open, allowing high-pressure steam to rush through a series of carefully designed chambers. The steam would hit rotating blades, which would interrupt the flow in rapid succession, kind of like putting your finger in and out of a water stream. This interruption would create a loud, pulsing wail. Think of it like a massive, steam-powered whistle. But the valve didn't open fully. It also didn't close. Instead, it jammed in a partially open position, about 40% open, according to the later investigation. This created a situation the engineers had never anticipated. High-pressure steam began flowing through the partially opened valve at an odd angle. Instead of hitting the rotating blades properly, it created a kind of feedback loop within the resonance chambers. The steam would enter, hit the walls at an angle, bounce back, and create interference patterns with the incoming steam. What emerged was not the sharp, piercing wail the siren was designed to produce. It was something far more unsettling. The siren began generating a low-frequency resonance, somewhere between 20 and 30 hertz. This is right at the lower edge of human hearing, in a frequency range that we don't so much hear as feel. It's the same frequency range as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and thunder. And it was incredibly powerful. Inside the boiler room, James Sullivan, a maintenance worker who had just arrived for his shift, was the first to realize something was terribly wrong. He felt the vibration in his feet, traveling up through the floor. He looked up and saw the steam pipes shaking. Then he heard it, or rather felt it. He ran toward the boiler controls, shouting for McIntyre. But McIntyre was already there, staring at the pressure gauges in confusion. The pressure was dropping, which made no sense if a valve had opened, but the siren was clearly active. Sullivan grabbed a wrench and ran toward the roof access ladder. If he could reach the siren's manual shut-off valve, he might be able to stop this. But as he climbed the ladder, the vibration intensified. The metal rungs buzzed in his hands. His vision began to blur, a known effect of extreme low-frequency sound exposure. Some workers would later report feeling nauseous, disoriented, and experiencing visual distortions. Sullivan reached the roof. The siren towered above him, the brass cylinder vibrating so violently it appeared blurred. Steam was venting from multiple joints in the system. The pressure had already begun to stress the connections. He approached the manual shut-off valve, a large, wheel-shaped handle at the base of the siren. And then he understood the problem. The valve was already closed, or at least it was supposed to be. The indicator showed it in the off position, but steam was clearly flowing. Something inside the system had failed. Sullivan did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the main steam shut-off valve, the one that would cut steam flow to the entire siren assembly. It required both hands and all his strength to turn. Below, in the town, people were reaching their breaking point. 20 minutes of this sound was pushing some toward hysteria. On the roof of the mill, Sullivan threw his full weight against the valve wheel. It moved, inch by agonizing inch. And then, finally, it closed completely. The silence was deafening. Literally, in some cases. Several people would later report temporary hearing loss or a ringing in their ears that lasted for hours. But in that first moment, what struck everyone was the absolute, total absence of sound. The sound had been so all-consuming, so overwhelming, that its sudden absence felt like a physical presence, like the air itself had changed density. For nearly a full minute, the town remained frozen in stunned silence. Then slowly people began to move, to look around, to realize that whatever had happened was over. In the town square, Father O'Brien stopped ringing the church bells. The crowd began to murmur, quiet at first, then growing louder as people tried to make sense of what they'd just experienced. At the school, Miss Henderson did a head count of her students, all present, all frightened but unharmed. And in the mill, James Sullivan collapsed against the siren housing, his hands shaking from the effort of closing the valve. But the story doesn't end there, because in 1894, in a small New England town where most people had never traveled more than 50 miles from where they were born, what had just happened defied explanation. Within an hour, crowds had gathered outside the mill. People wanted answers. Some were angry, convinced the mill had endangered them. Others were simply confused, and more than a few were still terrified, believing that what had stopped might start again. Jonathan Whitmore, the mill owner, faced the crowd from the front steps of his factory. He was a respected man in the community, but right now he looked shaken. His expensive suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled. "I give you my word," he told the assembled crowd, "that we are investigating what happened. The siren has been disconnected from the steam system entirely. It will not sound again." But that wasn't enough for many people. "What was that?" someone shouted from the crowd. Whitmore hesitated. because the truth was he didn't fully understand it himself. He knew the siren had malfunctioned. He knew steam had been involved. But why it had created that particular sound, that bone-rattling, terror-inducing vibration, he couldn't explain. The local newspaper, the Riverside Herald, sent a reporter immediately. Within 2 days, the story had spread to regional papers in Boston and New York. Within a week, it had become a minor national sensation. The headlines varied. Mysterious sound terrorizes New England town. Mill accident or supernatural phenomenon. The sound that couldn't be explained. Some of the coverage was sensationalist, suggesting everything from underground caverns opening up to magnetic disturbances from the Earth's core. But a few newspapers took a more measured approach, interviewing engineers and acoustics experts. The local police documented the incident in detail. Constable William Davies filed a report that included testimony from dozens of witnesses. He noted broken windows, 17 in total across the town. Structural damage to 3 buildings where vibration had loosened mortar, and numerous reports of livestock distress. Horses had bolted, cows had stopped giving milk for 2 days, and every dog in town had apparently lost its mind. But perhaps the most telling documentation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Harold Meacham, the town physician, began seeing patients complaining of unusual symptoms in the days following the incident. Headaches, nausea, disorientation, trouble sleeping, and a persistent sense of anxiety, as if the sound might return at any moment. He documented each case carefully in his medical journal. Years later, researchers studying the effects of infrasound exposure would find his notes invaluable. Mary Henderson, the school teacher, wrote in her diary, "3 days have passed since the morning of the sound. The children are still frightened. Many will not enter buildings alone. Some wake from nightmares. We adults try to reassure them, but how can we? We felt the same terror. We simply hide it better." What's fascinating is that different people described the experience in remarkably different ways. Some described it as mechanical, like a giant machine grinding. Others used organic metaphors, like the earth was breathing, or like a heartbeat from below. And a significant number described it in almost supernatural terms, like the sound of the world ending. This variety in description tells us something important about how humans process experiences that fall outside our normal frame of reference. When confronted with something truly unfamiliar, we reach for metaphors, comparisons, anything that might help us make sense of it. But in this case, the truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone in the town could have imagined. So what actually happened? Let's break down the science. The technical investigation, conducted by engineers from Industrial Safety Systems and an independent consultant from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, concluded that multiple factors had combined to create a perfect storm of acoustic phenomena. First, the valve malfunction. The valve had jammed due to a manufacturing defect. A small piece of metal, likely a fragment from the casting process, had become lodged in the valve mechanism. When the valve was closed, this fragment prevented it from sealing completely. When pressure built up in the system, the valve partially opened to the fragment's position and stuck there. Second, the frequency. The partially opened valve, combined with the specific geometry of the siren's resonance chambers, created what's called a Helmholtz resonator, essentially the same principle that makes a bottle whistle when you blow across the top. But in this case, the bottle was 4 feet tall, made of brass, and powered by high-pressure industrial steam. The frequency it produced, approximately 23 Hz, was almost perfectly tuned to create maximum discomfort in humans. Here's why. Human beings can hear frequencies from about 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. But frequencies below about 200 Hz, we don't just hear them, we feel them physically. The lower the frequency, the more we feel it rather than hear it. At around 20-30 Hz, something interesting happens. This frequency range resonates with several parts of the human body, the chest cavity, the eyeballs, and even internal organs. It's why you can feel the bass at a concert in your chest. It's why thunder rumbles in your bones. But it's also the frequency range associated with fear. Studies conducted much later would show that infrasound in this frequency range can trigger a stress response in humans. It's speculated that we evolved this sensitivity because many dangerous natural phenomena, earthquakes, large predator growls, avalanches, produce infrasound. Our ancestors who could sense and fear these sounds survived. The siren, through pure accident, had tapped into this primal response. Third, the valley effect. The town's geography amplified everything. Sound waves bounced off the valley walls, creating standing waves, places where the sound intensity was actually multiplied. Some parts of the town experienced the sound at double or triple the intensity of others. The MIT consultant, Professor Edwin Harding, demonstrated this by creating a scale model of the valley and using tuning forks to show how certain frequencies would be amplified by the geography. His report concluded that the town's location had turned it into an acoustic trap of unusual efficiency. Fourth, the duration, 20 minutes. In laboratory settings, exposure to infrasound for even a few minutes can cause discomfort. 20 minutes of continuous exposure had pushed some people toward panic attacks and temporary physiological effects. The combination of all these factors explained why people had experienced the event so intensely and so differently. Depending on where they were in the valley, the frequency and intensity varied. Some experienced it as primarily physical vibration. Others heard a sound component. Some experienced visual distortions. Others felt primarily emotional effects. But here's where the story takes a turn toward lasting impact. The incident at Riverside became a case study in industrial safety. Within a year, industrial safety systems had redesigned their siren system with multiple fail-safes. Other manufacturers followed suit. By 1896, new regulations in Massachusetts required that all factory warning systems be tested and certified. The regulations specifically mentioned acoustic safety, ensuring that warning systems could not accidentally produce harmful sound frequencies. The incident also caught the attention of early acoustics researchers. Professor Harding published a paper titled "On the Physiological Effects of Sustained Low-Frequency Sound" that cited the Riverside incident as a real-world example. This paper would later be referenced in military research during World War I when studying the psychological effects of artillery barrages. More broadly, the Riverside siren incident became part of a growing awareness that industrial technology, for all its benefits, came with risks that weren't always obvious. This was an era of rapid industrialization, when new machines and processes were being adopted faster than their risks could be fully understood. The mill itself continued operating for another 30 years. The siren was removed entirely and replaced with a traditional bell system. But people who lived through that October morning never forgot it. Mary Henderson's diary, preserved in the town's historical society, includes an entry from 20 years later. Heard a steam whistle today from the new cannery. For just a moment, I was back in that morning, feeling that terrible vibration. I suppose some fears are simply too deep to ever fully leave us. The town's newspaper archives show that for years afterward, any loud, unexpected noise would briefly panic the older residents. The trauma of those 20 minutes had left a mark that lasted a lifetime for some. Today, the incident is largely forgotten outside of industrial safety circles and acoustics research. The mill building still stands, converted into apartments. A small historical plaque mentions the factory's role in textile production, but says nothing about the morning of the sound. But the incident deserves to be remembered. because it illustrates something profound about the relationship between humans and technology. This wasn't a natural disaster. There was no earthquake, no explosion, no catastrophic structural failure. What happened at Riverside was purely technological, a complex machine behaving in an unexpected way, producing an effect its designers had never imagined. It was the sound of an industrial world that wasn't fully understood. In 1894, steam power was transforming society at a breathtaking pace. Factories, railroads, ships, all powered by the controlled explosion of water into steam. But with that power came risks, and some of those risks were subtle, unexpected, and impossible to predict without experience. The people of Riverside learned that lesson in the most visceral way possible. They learned that technology could affect them in ways that went beyond physical danger, that it could reach into their bodies, trigger primal fears, and leave psychological scars. And in learning that lesson, they helped ensure that future generations would be safer. So the next time you hear a factory whistle, a car alarm, or any loud artificial sound, remember, someone somewhere probably learned the hard way how to make it safe, how to make sure it warns without causing panic, how to harness power without unleashing consequences we don't understand. The morning of the sound in Riverside, Massachusetts, was a 20-minute lesson in humility before the power of physics, engineering, and human vulnerability. And it's a lesson we're still learning today.